Avant d'écouter les intervenants pour cette séance de clôture, rapidement, quelques minutes, je vais faire une petite synthèse de l'ensemble des tables rondes auxquelles tout le monde n'a pas pu forcément assister. Alors, il y a eu 4 ateliers au total et un certain nombre de thèmes ont été passés en revue. Commençons par la compétitivité. Je retiens que l'Europe, berceau de l'automobile, restera un marché important, mais qu'est-ce la seule région du monde à ne pas avoir retrouvé les niveaux de production d'avant la crise et que ce ne sera toujours pas le cas a priori en 2020, même si 2014 sera mieux que 2013 et ainsi de suite. Alors, comment faire ? Pas si simple, des accords ont été passés en France chez les constructeurs français pour préserver l'emploi et s'engager en faveur d'une plus grande compétitivité. Mais il est singulier de constater que Renault est passé en 10 ans de 1,3 million de véhicules à 500 000 avec 5 usines, exactement les volumes que produit une seule usine, celle de Sunderland chez Nissan en Angleterre. Mais la bonne nouvelle, et ça a été dit, c'est que l'usine Renault de Flins va accueillir prochainement des Nissan Micra, comme quoi ça a du bon de faire partie d'une alliance. Nous avons aussi l'exemple, bien sûr, ici de Toyota, qui à Valenciennes produit la Yaris et la Yaris hybride, et qui d'ailleurs exporte même vers les USA. Pour rester compétitif, il faut tenir les coûts, mais aussi faire de la qualité, un argument qui compte auprès des clients pour l'image. Nous n'avons pas forcément à rougir par rapport aux Allemands, auxquels on se compare souvent. Un Français en France et un étranger en France peuvent donc faire aussi de la qualité. Et pour obtenir cette qualité, il est primordial d'avoir une relation de confiance avec les équipementiers, qu'il faut aider pour qu'ils puissent se développer. Je l'ai entendu dans le Nord-Pas-de-Calais, il y a de vraies pépites, comme sans doute dans d'autres régions de France, des entreprises qui ont un savoir-faire et qu'il faut soutenir pour qu'elles puissent tenter leur chance à l'international. Aller chercher du business en dehors des frontières, voici donc un axe de développement. Ce qui est important aussi, c'est d'avoir de bons collaborateurs. Voilà qui me permet de faire la jonction avec la table ronde numéro 2 sur les compétences. Les constructeurs doivent renouveler régulièrement leurs effectifs et s'entourer de nouveaux talents. Il leur faut des spécialistes du véhicule connecté, des experts en informatique, entre autres, des profils qu'il faut détecter dès l'université et arriver à séduire pour les faire travailler dans l'industrie automobile plutôt que, par exemple, dans les télécoms. Chez un constructeur comme PSA, il y a aujourd'hui 130 métiers qui sont recensés officiellement. Certains vont sans doute disparaître et être remplacés par d'autres d'une culture mécanique, majoritairement. Il va falloir évoluer vers plus d'électronique et d'électrique. Parlons à présent de mobilité. Comme cela a été dit ce matin dans la présentation de Deloitte, la propriété reste le modèle dominant, mais il est amené à évoluer. On va sans doute louer de plus en plus, donc évidemment location longue durée, par exemple, autopartage, soit des modèles thermiques, soit des modèles électrifiés. Car le véhicule électrique à batterie et l'hybride rechargeable font partie bien sûr de l'équation en vue de 2020 et au-delà. À ce propos, il a été dit cet après-midi qu'en 2050, on ne produirait sans doute plus de voitures à moteur thermique à cette échéance. Je précise aussi que la région Nord-Pas-de-Calais a initié une forte dynamique autour du véhicule électrique avec un plan de déploiement de 2500 bornes. Revenons toutefois à la notion de véhicule partagé car c'est très important. Cette tendance est à la fois une opportunité et une menace pour les constructeurs. Une menace car la voiture, si elle est de plus en plus partagée, cela veut dire qu'on va en fabriquer de moins en moins. Mais en même temps, n'est-ce pas aussi une réponse pour contourner le problème du coût pour ces produits de plus en plus chers et complexes ? Voyons cependant le bon côté des choses. Il est possible alors de faire du service, de vendre de la mobilité, pas seulement de la location, de nouveaux modèles restent à construire. Transition toute trouvée avec, bien sûr, l'innovation, car le salut est de toute façon dans l'innovation. Innovation sur le véhicule lui-même, avec toujours plus de connectivité, des systèmes qui évitent les accidents, mais aussi de nouveaux matériaux plus souples, écologiques. Et pourquoi pas demain, une voiture à imprimer avec une imprimante 3D et assemblée chez soi. L'innovation s'appliquera aussi au niveau du service, bien sûr. Avec la montée en puissance des smartphones, des réseaux sociaux et de l'Internet des objets qui vont transformer notre univers au quotidien, eh bien, le travail des développeurs, bien sûr, va devenir de plus en plus complexe. Comment, en effet, imaginer la voiture de demain et après-demain dans un monde en perpétuelle évolution ? Peut-être en consultant en direct ses clients, comme cela se fait de plus en plus à travers des concours ou des appels à projets. Peut-être également en travaillant avec de nouveaux partenaires comme Google, qui était là tout à l'heure, et qui s'intéresse à la fois à la voiture connectée et à la voiture qui roule toute seule. Clairement, cela passe aussi par la veille et des échanges, de façon à faire circuler la bonne information. J'en reviens à la coopération avec les fournisseurs. Si les partenaires arrivent à travailler dans le cadre d'une vision partagée et dans une relation de confiance et de respect mutuel, alors oui, il sera plus facile de préparer les véhicules pour 2030, et même les constructeurs qui ont hérité du poids du passé et qui répliquent les codes d'une industrie à fort volume pourront à leur tour se montrer agiles et mieux s'adapter aux contraintes de la société. À présent, je laisse Willy de Backer pour gérer donc la dernière partie. Willy, c'est à vous.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laurent, for this wrap-up of the workshops and what was being discussed there. We're going to move indeed to already the last session of this, I think, very interesting day. Some of you might already be a little bit tired after all the hard work that we have been doing. So we thought it would be a good idea to have a few wake-up calls, and certainly two of my speakers here will, I think, have some provocative things to say which could probably get you out on your feet again to make sure that we're still surviving this last session. But first of all, I have to announce to you that there will be a small change in the program. We had normally two closing speeches, one by Monsieur Million-Rousseau, who is here and who will do the final closing speech, but also there was one planned by Monsieur de Saint-Ignon. Malheureusement, il n'est pas là, he's not here, and he will be replaced by Monsieur Frédéric Chéreau on my left side. And the thing is, he has to leave a bit earlier, so I decided that he could have his closing speech kind of as the opening of this session here, and I'm giving him about 10 to 15 minutes if he can give his speech now. So it's up to you, you can go there if you want.
Bonjour. Good afternoon to you all. I won't do my speech in English, and I've heard it will be translated, so let me do it in French. Je vais parler en français. Je voudrais tout d'abord excuser, comme vous venez de le faire, mais le refaire à mon tour, excuser Pierre de Saint-Ignon, qui est extrêmement impliqué au niveau du Conseil régional sur cette question de l'industrie automobile, très présent dans le cadre du pôle régional de la filière automobile, dont il a sûrement été question aujourd'hui et dont j'aurai l'occasion de reparler. Voilà, mais qui ne pouvait pas être des nôtres ce soir et qui a vraiment insisté pour que le Conseil régional soit représenté à cette clôture. Il m'a demandé de le faire, je vais essayer d'être à la hauteur de sa confiance. Je n'ai pas assisté à vos débats, j'ai un petit peu entendu le résumé qui en a été fait, tout simplement parce que j'étais ce matin à Paris pour parler du véhicule électrique et du projet que la région Nord-Pas-de-Calais porte, projet assez innovant justement de déploiement de bornes, dont je viens d'entendre mentionner le nom. Voilà, le projet de déployer 2500 bornes en l'espace de quelques années sur le territoire régional, et c'est une illustration du travail que fait la région sur cette réflexion, sur cette projection dans l'avenir de la filière automobile. Je pense encore une fois que les chiffres, vous les avez, les chiffres qui montrent l'importance de cette filière à l'échelle régionale: 36 000 emplois directs, 47 000 emplois au total à peu près en incluant les emplois induits, 7 sites constructeurs, plusieurs centaines de sites sous-traitants, une filière vraiment structurante pour le Nord-Pas-de-Calais qui représente un tiers de l'emploi industriel dans notre région. Une filière aussi régionale qui produit la moitié des moteurs produits en France. Et les moteurs, j'ai en tête les moteurs de la Française de mécanique qui, le sait-on, équipent certains des véhicules allemands de haut de gamme, je crois, chez BMW. Et certains acheteurs se disent, je vais acheter allemand, ce sera sûr au moins, j'aurai un bon moteur qui tournera, qui ne me fera pas de défaut. Et bien, ce moteur-là vient de France et vient du Nord-Pas-de-Calais. 30% des véhicules produits en France le sont dans la région Nord-Pas-de-Calais. Pour nous, l'industrie automobile est une industrie structurante, une industrie centrale, une industrie indispensable. Alors, pour autant, effectivement, cette industrie automobile connaît aujourd'hui une certaine crise. Le mot crise ayant plusieurs sens, du grec crisis, il y a un sens, une idée de transformation, de mutation, d'éclosion de quelque chose de neuf, parfois dans la douleur, mais toute crise n'est pas forcément négative quand elle aboutit à quelque chose de nouveau. Et je pense qu'il ne faut pas voir, pour le Nord-Pas-de-Calais, cette crise de l'automobile comme on a pu voir auparavant les crises des industries structurantes précédentes du Nord-Pas-de-Calais, la fin du charbon, la crise de la sidérurgie qui est toujours là, mais qui a beaucoup souffert. Si je prends l'exemple du charbon, on était sur simplement un changement, un épuisement des filons déjà, un changement du marché à l'international qui faisait que le charbon français n'était plus de toute façon compétitif. Il a fallu abandonner, passer à autre chose. L'autre chose ayant d'ailleurs été l'automobile, il y a eu un geste fort de l'État à cette époque-là pour installer l'automobile en Nord-Pas-de-Calais. Aujourd'hui, nous ne sommes pas du tout dans la même logique. La mobilité, ça a été dit, est nécessaire plus que jamais. On a de plus en plus besoin d'être mobile de toutes les façons possibles. L'automobile reste le mode de mobilité finalement le plus souple, le seul qui permet le porte-à-porte intégral sans rupture de charge. Nous aurons toujours besoin d'automobiles. C'est donc plus à une transformation, une évolution à la fois des modes de consommation, des modes de production que nous allons assister. Et cette transformation, il faut que la région Nord-Pas-de-Calais, vraiment, y prenne toute sa part, s'y engage complètement. Et s'il y a par contre une habitude industrielle que nous devons abandonner dans le Nord-Pas-de-Calais, mais nous sommes en train de le faire depuis déjà des années, c'est de cesser d'être simplement un site de production à forte intensité de main-d'œuvre, mais avec une intensité de matière grise trop faible. Nous l'avons été pendant des années, nous ne voulons plus l'être aujourd'hui, et c'est la logique de toute la réflexion que nous menons. Par exemple, dans le cadre du master plan que nous avons rédigé avec Jérémy Rifkin et son équipe. L'idée de dire nous ne voulons plus simplement attendre qu'on nous amène des industries et puis que tous les 30 ans on en change. Nous voulons être proactifs, nous voulons nous dire le changement c'est en permanence dans l'industrie, dans l'économie, et nous voulons être partie prenante des évolutions. Oui, le mot changement fait sourire quelques-uns. Je dirais c'est une transformation, destruction, création permanente dans l'industrie. On ne peut plus se dire on est sur un modèle de 30 ans et ensuite on en change. Non, nous devons accompagner ces mutations. Pouvoirs publics, industriels doivent enrichir en permanence l'industrie régionale de façon à ce qu'elle reste compétitive, qu'elle garde sa place, qu'elle gagne des marchés, qu'elle innove, qu'elle apporte des solutions. Alors ça, c'est le discours général. Concrètement, comment on fait ? Déjà aujourd'hui, la région Nord-Pas-de-Calais a mis en place ce pôle régional de la filière automobile. Alors, la région, pas toute seule, la région est partie prenante avec les industriels, avec la filière, avec la préfecture. L'idée, c'est déjà d'essayer d'accompagner l'industrie sur tout ce qui n'est pas le cœur de métier, ce qui n'est pas l'innovation. Ça, c'est aux industriels, aux entreprises de le faire. Mais faire en sorte que, par exemple, on ne voit pas un sous-traitant mourir simplement pour de bêtes raisons de problèmes de trésorerie. Qu'on ne voit pas une entreprise manquer un palier de croissance simplement parce qu'on n'a pas trouvé la bonne personne ou formé la bonne personne. Accompagner dans la région les relations entre donneurs d'ordre et sous-traitants. Tout ce travail-là, défendre la filière, identifier tous nos atouts, faire cette fameuse analyse SWOT ensemble, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, merci. Voilà. Force, faiblesse, chance, risque, tous ensemble, avoir une image partagée, un diagnostic partagé de notre filière et pouvoir ensemble l'apporter. On parlait de l'industrie allemande tout à l'heure. Tout n'est pas à prendre en Allemagne, même s'il y a beaucoup de leçons à prendre. Une des leçons à prendre, c'est justement ce travail que certains appellent en meute. Quand il y a des intérêts communs, les travailler ensemble, être capable de défendre en commun nos filières, être capable de faire avancer en commun nos intérêts et notre industrie. Et la région Nord-Pas-de-Calais veut être vraiment partie prenante de cette réflexion-là. Et puis au-delà de ça, la région veut être un aiguillon, un apporteur d'aide pour ce qui relève vraiment de la transformation du modèle économique de l'automobile. Et je vais prendre l'exemple, puisque je le connais, étant donc en charge du grand projet véhicule électrique en tant qu'élu à la région, aux côtés d'un technicien qui est Laurent Candelier, voilà, qui est là et qui est la cheville ouvrière de ce projet. Notre idée, c'est qu'effectivement, je crois que c'est des choses qui ont dû être dites aujourd'hui, il y aura toujours des voitures. Même si le parc a tendance à stagner, voire à baisser un petit peu, il se transforme. En 2030, probablement, il n'y aura plus uniquement des voitures individuelles, voilà, propriété d'une personne ou d'un ménage. La part de voitures en autopartage aura augmenté, même si elle ne représentera pas forcément 100% du parc. Les motorisations auront changé. La voiture au GPL, la voiture électrique plus complément à hydrogène, toutes ces motorisations vont se compléter. Là encore, ce n'est pas une transformation à 100%. Je ne sais pas s'il n'y aura plus de véhicules thermiques en 2050. En tout cas, il y aura sans doute une forte part de véhicules électriques et les véhicules seront répartis selon les usages. Se dire qu'on a le véhicule couteau suisse qui fait tous les courses ou chercher le petit à l'école et puis Paris-Marseille, pas forcément. J'entendais tout à l'heure ce matin un constructeur que je ne citerai pas qui disait voilà, nous on propose aujourd'hui des solutions véhicules électriques plus à côté un abonnement chez un loueur de véhicules. Vous avez 4 mois gratuits chez ce loueur de véhicules et voilà, quand l'été vous voulez partir prendre une grosse berline thermique pour partir en vacances, ça fait partie de l'offre, ça fait partie du pack. Donc justement, on va être de plus en plus, non pas vers de la vente de véhicules, mais de la vente de solutions. Cette évolution-là, les pouvoirs publics peuvent l'accompagner. S'il y a 100 ans, le véhicule thermique a pris son essor, et d'ailleurs, pour la petite histoire, à l'époque, l'a emporté sur le véhicule électrique, qui avait déjà un beau départ il y a 100 ans. Le premier véhicule électrique qui a roulé à plus de 100 km/h, c'était en 1899, donc même pas au XXe siècle. À l'époque, c'est parce qu'on a fait le choix politique de développer de mettre des enrobés sur les routes, de développer la signalisation routière, de mettre des stations-service un petit peu partout, et le véhicule thermique a pris son envol. Aujourd'hui, nous faisons le choix, en Nord-Pas-de-Calais, de dire installons les infrastructures, permettons aux gens de sortir de l'expérimentation. J'ai ma petite voiture électrique, j'ai ma prise chez moi, mais ensuite, je fais comment? S'il y a un réseau suffisamment large déployé à l'échelle d'une région, et d'autres réseaux se mettent en place. À Paris, vous avez le réseau Autolib, vous avez plusieurs régions qui y pensent. À partir du moment où on passe sur des infrastructures à cette échelle, nationale, voire continentale, on rend possible le développement de la voiture électrique. Alors, il y aura tout un travail d'accompagnement, de pédagogie à côté de ça. Le constructeur qui était là ce matin disait « Mes clients sont très réticents au début. Acheter un véhicule électrique, on saute à la mer. Est-ce que ça va marcher? Qu'est-ce que je vais en faire? Et si je tombe en panne ?» Puis 6 mois plus tard, les gens reviennent en disant ben voilà, mon thermique qui reste à la maison tout le temps, parce qu'en fait, au quotidien, pour les petits trajets, c'est l'électrique. C'est un pari que nous faisons, c'est un pari sur lequel nous sommes accompagnés par des constructeurs, nous sommes accompagnés, y compris par des constructeurs de matériel, de bornes de rechargement, dans la région, parce que justement, c'est aussi, à côté de l'automobile strictement, là aussi, il y a une industrie régionale à défendre. Et nous faisons ce pari, nous essayons d'installer, j'en inaugure une demain, des bornes dans les lycées Nord-Pas-de-Calais, puisque les lycées sont une des compétences de la région, et nous nous disons que finalement, faire de la pédagogie dans ces lieux-là, dans les lycées, en priorité ceux où on forme au métier de l'automobile, mais pas seulement, tous, c'est préparer déjà les générations de demain. Voilà, on avance à petits pas, notre objectif est modeste. Si dans quelques années, nous avons 10 000 véhicules électriques qui roulent dans la région, nous en sommes encore loin, ce sera déjà une très bonne chose. On verra par la suite. De toute façon, c'est une aventure qui nous enthousiasme beaucoup. Et ce dont nous sommes sûrs, c'est que nous serons toujours en 2030 aux côtés de notre industrie automobile Nord-Pas-de-Calais, mais qu'elle aura d'ici là beaucoup changé. Merci à tous.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Chéreau. That was kind of a closing speech, but as I said, I've promised you some more provocative interventions, and I'm going to now have the pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Howard Gutman, who actually was the ambassador in Belgium, so in my home country, for a lot of years, and we know him quite well in Brussels. He's somebody who can really wake people up, and I think that he's going to do that with his speech. He's going to look, of course, at the competitiveness issue of the European car sector from an American perspective, but I think he probably will have a lot of interesting things to say. Mr. Gutman, you have the floor.
Je regrette que mon français est très mauvais. J'étudie français lundi, mercredi et vendredi, et néerlandais mardi et jeudi. Et les deux très difficiles, so je continuerai en anglais. It was never easy to be the U.S. ambassador in Belgium. But I was the U.S. ambassador in Belgium for 4 years, finishing at the start of August of this year, just a couple of months ago. Having served 4 years, it made me the third longest serving U.S. ambassador to Belgium in over 100 years. And it was 4 wonderful years. Before the ambassadorship, I was a 27-year lawyer in Washington, D.C. I had also helped start an alternative energy private equity fund when I got the call from Barack Obama asking me while I was interviewing to be Deputy Secretary of Energy, whether I would represent him in Belgium instead. Since leaving the ambassadorship in August, this is my 6th trip back to Belgium. In addition to giving speeches, I serve on some boards and consult for corporations and funds on issues of energy, of trade, foreign affairs, focusing mainly on the United States and Europe, of course, but Turkey, Russia, and some countries in the Middle East, which leads to a critical question: what the heck do I know about the future of the car industry in Europe? And indeed, I have a confession to make. I do not know the difference between a carburetor and a coffee maker. But in fact, I'm pretty confident that the future of the car industry in Europe has very little to do with cars. Indeed, it may have far more to do with the future of Europe, the future look of Europe, the future of America, and the future look of America. Indeed, the questions about the future of the car industry in Europe may be best answered the same exact way I answer a question I get asked every week. Every week, someone, usually in Europe, comes up to me and says, "Will Hillary Clinton be elected president in 2016? And I tell them that I can answer with 100% certainty whether Hillary Clinton will be the next president in 2016 if they will tell me what 2016 looks like. And I can tell you with 100% certainty what the car industry in Europe will look like in 2016 if you will tell me what Europe will look like in 2016. You see, the biggest mistake that business leaders make, that politicians make, that the media makes in planning for the future is making those plans based on the facts as they exist at the present. You cannot be planning for 2016 assuming a world of 2013. You can only plan for the future by envisioning what the future will look like. As a business person or official, to understand what the future looks like, you have to understand the past. You have to consider where you've come from and understand where you're going. Now, nowhere was that lesson more important, more critical, than understanding the U.S. car market and the future of the U.S. car market as little as 4 years ago in 2009. 2009 is when I became ambassador and came to Europe. And remember that it wasn't very long ago, but in 2009 we were in the middle of the crisis. Banks were failing every day in the United States. People would wake up, look at the headlines to figure out where to move their checking account from which bank to another so they wouldn't lose their funds. And the U.S. car industry was collapsing every day on the front page of the paper just 4 years ago. We had the big company car bailouts, and it looked hopeless. If you asked me then about the future of the U.S. car industry, if you asked anyone in Europe or the United States then about the future of the car industry, and they could not see the future of America, they would have told you there was no future to the car industry in the United States. And in fact, I dealt with that issue as soon as I got to Belgium. Chevy had been taken over, and the Opel factory in Antwerp was being closed, and that cost jobs in Antwerp. And there's nothing more important for a government official, nothing more important for diplomatic relations during a crisis than saving jobs. I apologized all the time for the closing of the Chevy Opel plant. I took blame, and I bled with the Belgian workers for the loss of their jobs. But truth be told, I knew that we, America, Belgium, and Europe, I knew that we had to learn from that experience. We had to view that as the past to build a better future, or I knew that would not be my last plant closing, and it wasn't. But no one could see back then in 2009 what the better future would look like in the United States. And without predicting what 2013 would look like in the United States, they couldn't tell you what the future of the car market would look like then. Now, partly in 2009, it was because the crisis was blamed primarily on sloppy banking, sloppy regulation. And the thought was if we only fixed bad government, we could fix the crisis, we could fix a car crisis. But the fact is that the long-term problems of 2009 were due more to a failed energy policy. We knew we could not see a future. We knew we could not see a future for the car industry because we couldn't see our way out of a failed energy policy. And when you couldn't see a future in America, the car industry in America had no future. Let me tell you what our energy policy was at the time. We borrowed mainly from the Chinese and spent $800 million a day on Mideast oil, often to countries that weren't our greatest friends. We were burning the oil and coal and killing our environment. We were not creating the jobs in the energy field. We were not creating jobs in the future. We were bleeding jobs, and when we bled jobs, Antwerp bled jobs. We had a manufacturing industry in decline. We had a car industry in decline because of our high runaway energy costs. And it wasn't even high labor costs or competition from the East, because we had spent, as Europe had spent, a decade managing around labor costs by becoming more and more technology industrial driven. Labor was down, it was all machine driven, but that meant it was all about energy. So back in 2009, it appeared that by 2015, America would be the most energy poor and dependent country in the world. We could not see a future. And it looked like in 2015, with America as the most energy dependent country in the world, there wouldn't be no US car industry. But by 2011, just 2 years into my ambassadorship, we all knew we had been wrong. We all knew that if we had seen what 2013 would look like, the picture would be different. We knew that America had a bright future by 2011, that the American energy picture would be really bright, that American manufacturing would be really bright, and that the American car industry would have a really bright future. We knew that by 2011. With new technology, fracking, America was able to secure natural gas resources. All someone had to figure out was how to mix water, chemicals, and sand, put it under pressure, shoot it horizontally, control the methane gas, control earthquakes, and we would change our country. And that has changed the picture completely for American competitiveness, for American manufacturing, and yes, for the American car industry. So by 2011, 2 years into my ambassadorship, we knew that America would be the most energy dominant country in the world by 2015. So now we pay about a quarter as much as Europe and 1/5 as much as Japan for natural gas. So I can tell you with certainty, not whether Hillary Clinton will get elected in 2016, but about the future look of the US car industry. First, it cannot burn carbon, it can't burn regular gas. At $4 to $5 a gallon or 80 euro cents a liter, in a world of the changed energy picture in the United States, Americans will not in the future pay such prices. And it's not likely that we'll continue to discharge and create such carbon. We've cut our carbon footprint more than any country that stayed at Kyoto after we walked out by the move to natural gas. So the cars in Americans' future will either run on electricity or natural gas. And that's the battle. If you happen to be in Brussels, you may have seen the Tesla showroom. The Tesla showroom is the luxury high-end electric car, and it's doing really well, even as the Chevy Volt is not. So although prior electric car efforts have had moderate success, the fierce competition into researching the better battery, that will continue. And that competition is mainly between China and America. Whoever solves the battery will not only save the planet from carbon, but will capture the entire car market. A company that could patent a better battery could literally put all car dealers, car manufacturers out of business. It may be an American company, maybe a Chinese company, but whoever it is, they might own the entire car market. Now, I said that once in a speech while I was ambassador. 3 days later, I got a call from Prince Charles's office in the UK. He had heard about the speech. He headed something called the P8, and he asked whether he could meet me one-on-one in Brussels. So the US ambassador of Belgium got to meet Prince Charles one-on-one in Brussels and gave him permission to use the speech in search of a better battery. But you know, we didn't see the future enough there because the battery may not win. It may be natural gas. 3 weeks ago, perhaps the most important announcement in the car industry in the last 50 years was made. Let me repeat that. Hopefully nobody's sleeping now. 3 weeks ago, maybe the most important announcement in the car industry in the last 50 years was made, and almost no one heard it. It may have changed everything about the future of the global car market, and almost no one heard it. The announcement was from Chevrolet. It announced that the 2015 Chevy Impala would run on both gasoline and natural gas. It will be able to run on natural gas completely. And if a driver can find a natural gas station, because I don't know where there's a single one in the United States today, the car can run on gasoline like every other car. Now remember what I said before about the shale gas revolution and natural gas costing 25% in the US of what it costs in Europe and 1/5 of what it costs in Japan. So to run a car in America on natural gas today, for those companies that have their own fleets and their own natural gas pumps, it costs to run on natural gas today in America between 18 and 35 euro cents a liter. While here, I just checked, it was a €1.60 a liter. Can you imagine the future of the car industries where in America they're running on 18 euro cents per liter, and in Europe it's costing 10 times that amount? So cars in America will be driving around on either electricity or natural gas, costing almost nothing. And when I say they'll be driving around, I mean that as well. You see, Eric Schmidt, one of the heads of Google, Eric Schmidt is probably the smartest person I've ever met. I've now gotten to meet him 3 times. And each time I left that meeting saying, boy, that guy's the smartest guy I've ever met. The last time was in June. I took then the Crown Prince, now the King of Belgium, and a trade mission to meet with Eric Schmidt. And Google has spent a lot of money developing the driverless car, a car that uses sensors to drive without being controlled by a human. And Eric Schmidt believes that perhaps as soon as 5 years, insurance companies will offer 2 different types of rates. One rate will be offered that will be lower as long as you agree not to drive your car, and then a higher rate if you insist on driving your car. So that's the future of the American car market. Vigorous manufacturing, inspired by low energy costs, producing cars that ride on electricity or natural gas, depending on who wins the battle, but in either event for about 18 or 20 euro cents per liter, and that drive themselves. And so now, what does the future of the car market look like for Europe? And that gets us back to where we started. To know what that future will look like, you need to tell me what Europe will look like in 2016 or 2020. Will Europe continue to move away from nuclear? refuse to frack for natural gas, no matter what controls on methane or controls on seismic activity, or whether there's waterless fracking to protect the water table? And will they continue to pay at least 4 times as much energy for natural gas? Will they wait for the U.S. to export natural gas at a time when the U.S. might be using its natural gas to power its own cars for 18 euro cents per liter? Will Europe be still buying American coal? The same American coal that when I arrived at the U.S. ambassador to Belgium, the Belgian energy minister then refused to meet with me because we burn coal. Now, if you know any Belgians, they'll tell you I worked really hard to become popular in Belgium. And I got to be friends, dear friends, with that energy minister. And when I had my goodbye visit, I said I wasn't sure I was going to come here today because you guys are burning our coal. So will they turn away from nuclear, turn away from natural gas, be relying on coal? Is that the Europe in 2016, paying 4 times or 5 times as much for natural gas? Or will they have solved the energy challenge? Will they have settled for the new, safer technologies? Or will they have decided to work together as Europe, maybe getting gas from Poland or the Ukraine, or the new amounts in Cyprus and Israel? Will there be a pipeline through Turkey? Tell me what the future looks like, and I'll know exactly what the future looks like for the car industry. Why is that the case? Because as we sit here today, as each one of you sits comfortably wondering about the cocktail party ahead, it costs less to manufacture a Mercedes-Benz in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and ship it to Stuttgart than it does to produce that same car in Stuttgart and deliver it next door from the Homer Mercedes, other than the VAT and the tariffs. Now, most of you won't remember that there's a free trade agreement being negotiated right now, shooting at those VATs and tariffs. And both sides of the Atlantic need that free trade agreement because it means a great deal for the economic future of both sides. But it increases the pressure on Europe to solve the energy challenge, to remain at all competitive in manufacturing, because if you eliminate the VAT and the tariffs, and if it's cheaper to produce Mercedes in Stuttgart and Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and ship them to Stuttgart, if you can't produce a Mercedes in Stuttgart anymore, where are you going to be able to produce it? You might want to invest in hotels in Tuscaloosa. Because, in fact, it isn't that expensive to ship cars. It's only expensive to ship one thing. What's the only thing that's expensive to ship? Natural gas. You've got to liquefy it. You got to put it on boats. You got to regasify it. I'm now on the board of a Belgian company called Exmar, which is a natural gas shipper. And Exmar is doing well, but it's not a solution for Europe's energy problems to take American gas and to buy it. It costs 4 times as much when it gets here. So there are critical questions facing Europe as we think about the future of the car industry. But it's not critical questions just for Europe, because the truth is those same questions are challenges for the United States. Because the truth is, I saw it every day of the ambassadorship, success today is a win-win proposition. America can only thrive and survive when Europe thrives and survives, and vice versa. We are each other's most important partners and most important markets. And so that takes me to my final thought. You see, I told you earlier about the problem I faced in 2009 as the ambassador with the closing of the Opel plant in Antwerp caused by the crisis. But I faced the problem again in 2013 as I was getting ready to be done with my 4 years of the ambassadorship with the closing of the Ford plant in Genk in Belgium. But this time it wasn't because of a banking crisis that was taking down the U.S. auto industry. In fact, when the announcement was made that Ford was closing the plant in Genk, Ford announced its most profitable quarter in years, globally. And I know, because I spoke to them all the time, that Ford understood and valued how productive the workers in Belgium were. But even with that hard effort, even with greater productivity, it just didn't make economic sense for Ford to produce the cars in Genk.
You have 1 minute. 1 minute, please.
It's getting late, so I cannot any longer tell you the story about Ski Week in Henk and the hostage taking and the differences in culture between Ford and Europe, but invite me to another speech and make sure someone says, tell the Ski Week hostage story. So for both Europe and the United States, the win-win is no more Ford Henk closings, no more Opel closings, more openings, with a policy that makes sense across the board. Greatly enjoyed getting to meet you today. Look forward to speaking at the cocktail party. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much. All the best.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for giving us the American perspective, and also, I think, highlighting very much the nexus between the energy revolution that we need and the car revolution or the mobility revolution that we have been talking about the whole day. I think you're absolutely right there to connect both issues in this sense. Paul, you're now going to have the, not the completely last speech, but I think an interesting speech on especially the sustainability dimension of the mobility revolution. Paul Nieuwenhuis is co-director in the Center for Automotive Industry Research in Cardiff, and has already been working for, I think, more than 25, 30 years in this area. And Paul just told us in another workshop that he owns a car which is 40 years old, which I think is really something to think about. But Paul, you have the floor.
Right, thanks very much. I do have a presentation here, as you can see, so if you don't want to listen to what I'm saying, you can at least look at the pictures. I've called this Observations on Sustainable Automobility, and that's essentially what it is. We've heard a lot of talk today about green cars, green mobility, sustainability, but we never define sustainability really, do we? A bit about me. I have two hats on. I'm co-director of the Center for Automotive Industry Research at Cardiff Business School. I'm also co-director of the Electric Vehicle Centre of Excellence at Cardiff University generally. The difference is that at Cardiff Business School, we look at technology and we're primarily interested in what it costs. This Centre of Excellence is a joint venture with our School of Engineering, so we do work with engineers, and still we're interested in what things cost. Because if things are too expensive, then all these marvelous technologies that now exist and are out there will not come to market. But there are some wider issues I want to explore with you. And at the bottom, I've got a phrase there that my colleague, fellow director of the center, uses, and he says, we are really philosophers of the car industry. As you're probably aware, the car industry is an industry of doers. There are not too many thinkers, and when they think one model generation ahead. We see it as our job, and it's kept us in a job for 25 years or so, to think about the industry longer term, higher level, and things like that. So you may find some of what I've got to say a bit peculiar, but there's 25 years of thinking behind it. First of all, when we think of sustainability, a lot of it is to do with resources, and the ambassador has already mentioned energy. There are, of course, other resources, and for some of those resources that we use quite intensively at the moment, including in the automotive industry, there is actually a limited supply, or a limited known supply. This is important. What the bars show here, the blue bars, is how long we can use this stuff at current rates of use. And you can see the number of years there. So with platinum, we've got 350 years left, which is good. The red bar shows if we start using them at half the US rate. And this would happen, for example, if China suddenly developed an industry. Now, as you all know, this is exactly what's happening. So we're essentially, over the next few years, doubling the car industry worldwide. And things we have been doing over the last 100 years with the car industry in what we have come to be known as the developed world, if we then double that, that will have an impact, and that impact could make the industry even less sustainable than it is today. Right. Briefly mention Jeremy Rifkin. He is an energy advisor, including to the European Union. I saw him speak last year in Toronto in Canada, and he said, the problem we've got at the moment is that we've got resource constraints that constrain economic development. So we'll see an increase in economic development, and then we'll hit a ceiling. And that ceiling is really over-demand for limited resources globally, including from China. And then we'll hit another recession. This is his argument, right? And then we'll have another recession, we'll climb up again. We'll keep hitting that ceiling of resources. So it is an important issue. Right, now, we don't like change much as humans. Humans like to keep things the way they are, to conserve things. And yet things change all the time. If you think back one generation, which is usually 30 years, you saw a completely different world. Again, as the ambassador mentioned earlier, even 5 years can see quite a different world emerge. So we don't like change, and yet what we do stick to is actually quite a high-risk strategy. As the ambassador mentioned, a lot of it is to do with energy. Our dependence on oil is really quite a high-risk strategy because although the Americans have some oil, we have very little other than in Norway. So we're making ourselves very reliable on regimes that not necessarily see the world the way we do. So it is really quite a high-risk strategy. If you look at the shale oil that's coming out of Canada at the moment, that a lot of people are very excited about, this is indeed an additional bit of oil. We've known all the time that it was there. There's also oil in Scotland, for example. It's just been very expensive to get at. But once we're prepared to pay over $100 a barrel, then these things suddenly become possible. But as you can see, the new oil we find is very small bits, really, compared to what we use and what we need. Right. Now, to understand all this, we have to accept that we are part of a natural system. And this diagram comes from ecology. And basically, ecologists say that you create a potentially stable ecosystem within that basin. If you think of the basin of the left and the yellow ball going around in it, you can actually move the ball quite a bit, which gives you all sorts of variabilities, and you don't change the system. You're all right. You're safe. But if you move the ball too much, then it can get to what they call a tipping point, and it comes down into another basin. That basin may give you a completely different set of operating conditions. Now, we don't know where those tipping points are, but we may well be running various experiments at the moment that will allow us to find out. And we don't necessarily want to be in one of these other basins. Now, we have two options. We can either stay where we are and avoid that tipping point, or we can make sure we're adaptable enough to adapt to that different situation if or when it arises. So those are the two options we've got. And that is indeed how natural systems deal with such things. Some systems have resistance. They stay the way they are, whatever you hit them with. Other systems are resilient. They change over time and change with a new set of operating conditions, and become, in some cases, only barely recognizable. Now, when you talk about natural systems, a lot of people we hit with a lot of people this particular situation. A guy called Herman Daly, who's an American economist, he identified that in society there are two mindsets. One mindset sees the economy as a subset of the environment. But there's another mindset who see the environment as a subset of the economy. And this is when you say, all right, first we have to make sure we've got enough jobs, that we've got our cars going, and then we will think about the environment. Right? Whereas that mindset up there would say, well, we can't, because the economy is part of the environment. It's important to realize that there are those two ways of looking at the world, especially when you're trying to discuss, when one of them tries to discuss with the other. And if you have Greenpeace, for example, talking to people in industry, very often you get this basic clash of cultures, basically different way of looking at the world. In reality, of course, this is how it works. The economy is a social exchange of goods and services, and that society fits into the natural environment, the environment. So this is the way we need to look at things. The problem, as always, is people. Sustainability is a very complex thing. When we first set up our sustainability center, which unfortunately is no longer funded, That's why I didn't mention it at the beginning. A lot of my colleagues said, what are you guys doing? You're all over the place. You have no focus. I said, well, yes, this is the problem about sustainability. It does affect everything. So it looks woolly to a lot of people. It does look unfocused. And that's what makes it difficult. People prefer reductionism, to break things down in little chunks that they can understand. Business and industry, and also business schools, as I know to my cost, employ very few sustainability experts. So very few people to look at this bigger sustainability picture. As you know, also people in organizations, including companies, tend to recruit people like themselves. They don't like to be challenged too much. So you create intellectual monocultures in a lot of organizations. You create a lack of diversity. As we know from ecology, a lack of diversity creates a very vulnerable ecosystem. So you may create an organization that's very good at dealing with the situation as it is today, but that can suddenly no longer cope with the situation as it might be in the future, one of those unknown futures that the ambassador referred to. You lose resilience. Right. I often use this slide with my students. Most of my students, about 3/4 of my students, are Chinese. Many others are Korean, Greek. I have very few British students. This year I have one. So most of my students are Chinese. That's why I don't know how many of you might recognize where that is on the right. Any volunteers? It's Hong Kong, right? So many of my students recognize that. I answered this question, which of these is a natural environment? This is a trick question. You know this is a trick question, don't you? Most people say, the one on the left. I said, how long would you survive in that environment? How natural is it to you? I know I wouldn't survive very long in that environment. I could survive in Hong Kong for a while, if I had money. So that is also a natural environment. Both of them are, in fact, natural environments. Why? We haven't got time for me to ask you all. I'm going to tell you, right? We have to think about why one of them is a natural environment and the other is not. This is a beaver lodge. You can just about see it. It's made by a beaver. This is in Canada, British Columbia in Canada. How are our buildings different from a beaver lodge? What does a beaver do? It chops down trees and then manages the water environment around it to create its lodge, and it uses dams and things like that. The beaver creates an environment that suits its own economic needs, right? To feed and to be happy, to protect itself from predators and things like that. It does exactly the same thing that we do. There are many conflicts between beavers and humans in North America because we interfere with each other's systems. So people say, well, that environment is unnatural. The question then is, in evolutionary terms, when did we become unnatural? When did that happen, right? Here we are. Was it here? Is this where we became unnatural? And what was the mechanism that created that thing? Right? That is the question. Are we unnatural? Of course we're not. We are part of nature. Right. But somehow we've come to see ourselves as separate from the environment. Here we've got the environment as a separate thing. It's these boffins, these experts in white coats saying, well, we can see this environment isn't doing very well. How many of these have we got to spare? As you probably know from footprint analysis, at the moment we're using more than one Earth, right? So we'll be behaving as if we've got another one in the cupboard, hiding away. Some countries, in the UK and in the Netherlands, we behave as if we've got 3 Earths, and the US behaves as if it's got 5 Earths, right? They're all in the cupboard somewhere. So we see ourselves as quite separate. Somebody calls this nature deficit disorder. We have a sort of psychological, psychiatric disorder whereby we see nature as something that is not part of us. Right, so I've said we are natural, just like the beaver is. That means that what we make is also natural. The distinction between natural and man-made is entirely of our own making. It's something we have invented. It's not real, right? This means that this is a natural object. Now, this is why I often lose my audience. Everybody is still awake, at least, but I'm sure I'm losing some of you. This is a natural object. It can't be anything else. Which is nice to know, isn't it? Right. When we're thinking of sustainability, our relationship with things objects, is a key element in how we need to progress from here into the future. It's at the core of a concept called sustainable consumption and production. There are whole strands of research, of meetings on this concept of sustainable consumption and production. Many governments have units that look at sustainable consumption and production because consumption and production are intertwined. You can't look at one without the other. Here's a quote from a philosopher about our relationship with products, and this is a very interesting one. He says, artifacts are not only products, they are gifts. They might be gifts from God or from nature, but their being has been bought at a price. The price can be animals slaughtered, trees felled, or mined. But a gift requires gratitude as a response. And he even says at the end, it is immoral to waste this. We have to think of our responsibility towards the things we create, because they're a gift. Right. Now, I took this picture at the Paris Salon a couple of years ago. These people love this Chevy. We do like American cars here in Europe. Our relationship with objects is very important. It's the key to sustainable consumption and production. But if we recognize these objects as part of nature in the way we are, will we learn to value them more? And if we value them more, will we use them in a less wasteful fashion? This is the question. Should we get more out of carefully chosen objects, carefully looked after, and keep them for longer, more durable? One of the principles of sustainable consumption and production has been debated a lot, is really, should we exchange quantity of consumption with quality of consumption? Consume fewer higher quality objects. They can be supplied by industry, they can be man-made, but could be less wasteful. The only thing is, how do we change from where we are to where we need to be? And there are many different theories about how things change. One of the theories we've been working with recently in the Electric Vehicle Centre of Excellence is socio-technical transition thinking. There's also, some of this work was sponsored by the European Commission indirectly through the Innovate project. What socio-technical transitions does, this is a Dutch theory, by the way, it looks at the world in these three levels. At the top we have landscape conditions. This is, for example, the oil price. In the middle we have the regime. This is the response, the industrial response to such landscape conditions. The way we organize the car industry, for example, is a regime. And at the bottom we have various niches that constantly challenge the regime. So if you look at the automotive sector, for example, we've got things like the hydrocarbon approach to our landscape. It could be natural gas, of course. It can be even biofuels. The way we sort of organize the industry is in the middle. And as you can see, there's a whole load of things that currently determine the regime, including legal structures. If you want to crash a car, there are certain assumptions of how a car is made. Audi found this when they first wanted to make an aluminium car, that the regime really was for steel cars and things like that. So there's a whole number of things. And then at the bottom, there are various niches that are chipping away and trying to come up with an alternative. Battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, Better Place, for example, as an alternative business model. They're constantly chopping away. So you get this very complex picture. This picture comes from a chap called Frank Geels, a Dutchman who's now working at the University of Manchester. And I've often said, I said, Frank, can you not simplify this picture? And he says, well, if you can come up with a better one, I'll adopt it. And I haven't managed it so far. This is, again, the same thing. At the top, you have the landscape, which goes up and down. In the middle, you have the regime. And at the bottom, you have all these niches. Now, many of these niches chopping away, and they're unsuccessful. Better Place is an example, unsuccessful. But ultimately, these niches can bundle, and if the pressure from the top, from the regime changes, for example, through very high oil prices, then suddenly these niches become viable, and they start chopping away at the regime, and ultimately change the regime. Frank Geels gives the example of the move from sailing ships to steamships, for example. These things take a while, but if you look at that particular historical example, it started with very small niche applications and then ultimately spread until steamships became the dominant regime. Right. In our industry, of course, to change anything that dramatically, you do need massive resources. So that means that change can only really come from a few directions. First of all, the existing OEMs. We've already seen presentations from Renault, for example, that they are beginning to put electric vehicles in place, for example. They could also come from SMEs with a lot of cash. And I'm mentioning Tesla here. A lot of the cash came from PayPal, for example. There's a Tesla over there in the picture. Or they can come from SMEs with public sector input. Again, Tesla got public sector support. But remember, there are other key innovations we've seen in recent decades that relied very much on the public sector. I mentioned the internet there. Satellite navigation really depended on a lot of work done for the defense industry, for example. So the role of the public sector in bringing about massive change is very important. In fact, if you look at Van Geels's example of the shift from sail to steam, at key points in the 19th century, there was public sector intervention to push technologies over a threshold. So we cannot ignore the public sector, and we cannot rely solely on the private sector to bring about such massive change. Right, nearly there. This adaptability I mentioned earlier on would also need to come about when we change to a different automotive technology. All sorts of things would need to be changed. And I mentioned this briefly in the workshop. If you were in the workshop where I spoke previously, I mentioned some of these. Manufacturing systems would need to change. You need to make batteries in large numbers if you want to make electric vehicles. You need to have supply chains for natural gas if that's the way you want to go. Service maintenance and repair regimes need to be adopted and adapted, which means you need skills to deal with those technologies. Skills are crucially important. And again, that's a role for the public sector in many cases. You can't just wait for the private sector to take those things. There will be new aftermarket opportunities that entrepreneurs can engage with, but sometimes entrepreneurs need help in doing that. And then, of course, regulatory and legislative structures need to be adapted. In the previous workshop, somebody showed a picture of the different signs we've got to indicate an electric vehicle charging point. There are 7, I believe, in use at the moment from that presentation. Standardization is important. Now, to give an example of adaptability, I've taken a French example. Not many of you may know, or many of you may know this, Peugeot. In fact, the activities of the Peugeot family go back many centuries, but as a company they go back to, I think, 1812 or something like that. Now, you may be aware in 1812 there were no cars. So what were these guys making? Well, not cars, obviously. They made something completely different. But the interesting thing is you find over time, Peugeot had a number of core activities and a number of fringe activities, which meant that with changing conditions in the environment, they could move away from some of those core activities and move into those fringe activities. This is exactly how an ecosystem adapts. If you look at an ecosystem, you get a variety of species. Some of them keystone species that are essential for the ecosystem survival. Some of them are core species, and some of them are peripheral species. And ecologists first say, well, why are these peripheral species there? They are there for this reason. When circumstances change, they become core species. They are no longer peripheral. They suddenly become important. Their role suddenly changes. And that allows the ecosystem as such to survive. And you find some companies like Peugeot, for example, have historically done the same thing. So again, you see that natural model. We work according to natural principles if we get it right. If you get it wrong, you go bust, of course. You know that as well. There is, of course, a lot of inertia in the system. If you've invested a massive amount in making internal combustion systems and all steel bodies, you're not just going to throw that away. This is why Amory Lovins in the 1990s said, the problem is that the industry thinks like accountants and not like economists. If they thought like economists, they would see the big picture and say, we will throw that away, because if we still want to be in business in 20 years, we need a completely different set of technologies. However, it is possible to still change. You can reduce risk, protect what you've got to some extent, and begin again to change on the periphery and use that natural model. You can, for example, introduce a new sub-brand like BMW is doing, the BMW i sub-brand. Now, this thing is far more radically different from other BMWs than most people think. It is sold as a battery electric vehicle, which is indeed correct, but it also has an aluminium chassis and a carbon fiber body structure. That is not how mass-produced cars are made. Those are radical technologies. But BMW is saying, we'll not stop making 3 Series and 5 Series, we'll do this on the side. This is a subspecies. But by having that subspecies in place, in 30 or 40 years' time, they can say, we will stop making the 3 Series and the 5 Series because we now have a new ecosystem, a new species that can run our ecosystem. So again, they're following natural principles in doing this.
Hold 1 minute.
Thanks very much. Perfect timing.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. I think it was a bit indeed an out-of-the-box way of looking at it, but I think also a very interesting point of view there. We have been talking the whole day about the future, of course, and the future, as we all know, is not predictable, as also the ambassador said. But I heard with these 2 last presentations 2 views in a way, one kind of claiming that we need an energy revolution, the other one claiming that we need a sustainability revolution, and probably we need both of them and at the same time. But also I think we need a kind of a social innovation revolution, because people will have to think about new business models and new ways of doing things completely out of the box, etc. But I think we have before we do the closing speech, we have maybe 5 minutes time if there is 1 or 2 burning questions from the floor for either the ambassador or for Paul here. If I do not see any hands, not immediately, no questions. Okay, if there are no questions, then can I introduce our last speaker for the closing session, please. Mr. Bernard Million-Rousseau, I would give you the floor then for the kind of closing speech of this afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't plan to speak as a final speaker today in such a way, so I do apologize. I prefer speaking in French. Et je vous propose d'aborder mon intervention en 3 points. Premièrement, boucler la boucle en me rapportant à l'introduction qu'a faite ce matin Frédéric. Deuxième point, exprimer un sentiment sur les perspectives de la filière, sur ses aspects techniques. Et puis, troisième point, perspective en ce qui concerne les hommes et les femmes au travail dans la filière. Alors, pour le premier point, Frédéric nous a expliqué ce matin qu'un des buts de cette journée, c'était de faire connaître cette région fortement marquée par l'automobile, la faire connaître en la replaçant à sa place sur la scène européenne, dans le dispositif France, et puis aussi la faire connaître bien mieux entre tous les acteurs du territoire, quels qu'ils soient. Le deuxième point que Frédéric a souligné était l'innovation, montrer l'importance de l'innovation, la nécessité que les acteurs de la filière ont à innover. En s'appliquant avant tout, et ça a été montré dans la journée, à bien comprendre les besoins de son client, quel que soit ce client, quelle que soit sa place d'acteur au sein de la filière. Et la crise qui perturbe et qui implique des difficultés pour de nombreux acteurs est aussi une immense opportunité pour tout acteur petit ou grand. Chacun a sa chance dans cette opportunité. Et je fais souvent en ce moment un parallèle entre la situation que nous connaissons dans l'industrie automobile aujourd'hui avec ce qui s'est passé au tout début du XXe siècle. Rappelons-nous les débuts de l'automobile, cette floraison de techniques, chacune avait sa chance. Le fait que les techniques étaient finalement intimement liées, je pense notamment à l'automobile et à l'aéronautique à cette époque-là, et les sciences étaient aussi intimement mêlées. Il a été souligné aujourd'hui l'importance qu'il y avait à faire en sorte qu'il y ait ce croisement à la fois des techniques, des technologies et des sciences. Et qui dit innovation, ça a peut-être été peu évoqué aujourd'hui, dit aussi effort d'investissement, un investissement qui est voulu, qui est pensé, continu, régulier. Frédéric a aussi parlé d'internationalisation. Comment apporter une meilleure prise de conscience de cette nécessité qu'ont les entreprises de la filière, pas que les entreprises d'ailleurs, puisque les écoles, on l'a vu, notamment les labos, etc., à se tourner, à comprendre que le jeu n'est plus le territoire, que le jeu n'est pas seulement l'Europe, mais que le jeu devient mondial, il s'est complètement généralisé, mondialisé. Et si j'ai la possibilité d'émettre un vœu, Frédéric, c'est peut-être que pour le prochain événement de ce type, qui sera sans doute organisé à l'avenir, eh bien peut-être faire davantage encore rentrer le monde au sein de cet événement. Et donc sur ces 3 points, sur ces 3 objectifs soulevés par Frédéric, il me semble que cette journée a correctement répondu aux attentes. Je passe sous silence les autres thématiques qui ont été abordées aujourd'hui et sur lesquelles mes collègues sont déjà revenus en soulignant certains points de synthèse. Et je me permets d'exprimer un grand bravo au nom de tous à l'équipe de Frédéric et de Luc pour l'organisation de cette journée. Le deuxième point, au niveau des perspectives, la filière a véritablement des atouts et mon sentiment est que la plateforme de la filière automobile que je représente devant vous aujourd'hui est justement là pour mieux les mettre en valeur. En ce qui concerne l'innovation technique, la PFA s'est dotée depuis un peu plus d'1 an d'un comité technique automobile qui a pour rôle finalement d'essayer de mettre en mouvement et d'exprimer une voix unique lorsque cela est possible entre les acteurs de la gouvernance de la filière pour pouvoir porter des messages plus cohérents, plus unifiés auprès des pouvoirs publics français et auprès bien sûr des instances européennes. Il en est de même pour ce qui touche aux compétences dont la filière a besoin dans les années à venir, que ce soit sur le plan qualitatif ou sur le plan quantitatif, ça a été d'ailleurs évoqué ce matin. Et pour ce qui concerne aussi l'attractivité des métiers, ils sont très variés, on l'a vu aussi, auprès des jeunes, de leurs parents et des enseignants. Comment faire pour finalement faire en sorte que les jeunes en France, quand on leur parle d'industrie et particulièrement d'industrie automobile, aient les yeux qui brillent. Je pourrais en dire de même aussi pour ce qui touche à la performance industrielle. Nous avons à faire un effort collectivement. Si l'on se réfère à ce que l'on peut voir à travers le monde au niveau des meilleurs niveaux mondiaux en termes de performance industrielle, lorsque l'on visite les territoires et les PME ou ETI qui les animent, notamment sur la filière automobile, on se rend compte que si certains des acteurs sont excellents, eh bien, il y a encore de trop nombreux acteurs industriels pour lesquels nous avons sans doute à faire prendre conscience d'un décalage qui perdure. Et pour parvenir à cela, il nous faut renforcer le travail en réseau, entre acteurs sur le territoire, entre les territoires, puisque le Nord-Pas-de-Calais, Picardie n'est pas le seul ensemble de régions importants sur le plan automobile en France, et finalement entre les pays européens. Alors, un petit exemple très concret que je vous donne, il y a quelques semaines, nous avons lancé entre la PFA et les pôles de compétitivité automobile, les 5 pôles dont Itrans fait partie, une réflexion afin de définir un processus de travail collaboratif entre la PFA et les pôles qui soit plus serré que par le passé. Les pôles vont dans les jours qui viennent s'exprimer sur les propositions faites et nul doute que nous renforcerons notre travail collaboratif dans les mois et les années qui viennent. Un autre exemple que je peux vous donner, c'est l'animation du réseau et des 15 associations régionales, comme celle de Nord-Pas-de-Calais et Picardie, puisqu'il y en a 15 en France aujourd'hui, que nous attachons à animer au sein de la PFA, puisqu'il est bien évident que nous avons des mutualisations d'actions à faire entre les différentes associations régionales, puisqu'on voit des choses intéressantes et très diverses sur l'ensemble du territoire. Et ceci, bien sûr, pour le bien des ETI et des PME de la filière. Troisième point, les perspectives en ce qui concerne la richesse des entreprises, et là je veux parler des hommes et des femmes. Je crois que dans une session dans laquelle je n'étais pas, quelqu'un a montré aujourd'hui que finalement, peut-être plus l'entreprise était petite et plus les compétences humaines qui composaient cette entreprise étaient à considérer comme un véritable investissement précieux. Et je reste résolument optimiste. Cette crise nous pousse à trouver de nouvelles solutions, de nouveaux chemins sur le plan social. Certains grands acteurs ont commencé à montrer la voie et je suis certain qu'ils vont être suivis. Mais il nous reste sans doute encore à mieux travailler au sein d'un même bassin d'emploi, par exemple, entre les différentes filières. Vous savez qu'en France, il y a 13 filières. Il y a aussi une volonté pour essayer de faire du transfilière. Et l'exemple du développement des relations qui se développent entre l'automobile et le ferroviaire sur ce territoire en est un bon exemple que nous suivons avec grande attention. Et nous devons nous remettre en question collectivement sur les raisons des manques répétés dans des métiers de base, je reste très terre à terre, comme des soudeurs, comme des outilleurs, comme des chaudronniers, comme des conducteurs de machines, comme des managers de premier niveau dans nos usines. Ce sont des manques qui reviennent d'une façon régulière lorsque nous visitons les PME et les ETI de la filière. Nous avons à trouver ensemble les bonnes solutions, mais après avoir posé les vrais problèmes, les bons problèmes. Alors cette crise nous a poussés à la prise de conscience. Les problématiques sont connues. À nous, ensemble, d'apporter les meilleures solutions pour la génération de nos enfants et pour les générations qui vont suivre. Merci pour votre écoute.
Merci beaucoup, M. Bernard Millon-Rousseau. On est venu à la fin de cette longue journée, mais une journée, je trouve, qui était très intéressante. Il ne me reste rien que de remercier quelques personnes, surtout déjà les interprètes qui ont fait un travail énorme pour nous. Ce n'était pas toujours facile, je trouve, mais quand même, ils ont fait un bon travail. Aussi les techniciens qui nous ont aidés avec tout le support technique, etc., etc. Je voudrais aussi remercier le team de M. Russen qui a aussi fait la logistique et a aidé avec toutes les préparations de ces débats ici. Et puis naturellement le PFA et tous les autres organisateurs que je ne connais pas par cœur et que je ne connais pas personnellement entre-temps, mais je trouvais que c'était une journée très intéressante et j'espère que vous auriez encore des bons débats suivants, ou bien maintenant, ou bien dans un prochain moment, parce qu'il y a, comme vous avez vu, beaucoup de challenges, beaucoup de défis, mais certainement vous avez la capacité, et vous avez la capacité intellectuelle, mais aussi technologique, de résoudre les problèmes, les challenges qui seront là. Et comme ça, éventuellement, maintenant, je vais vous demander un grand applause pour tout le monde qui a, et aussi notre speaker ici, qui ont contribué à cette journée. Merci bien et au revoir.
Mesdames, Messieurs, c'est donc effectivement la fin de cette première édition du Feal en anglais. J'espère qu'en tout cas vous avez eu un bon feeling pour cette journée. Je rappelle qu'il y a des questionnaires de satisfaction. Nous vous remercions de bien vouloir les remplir. Et donc, suivant une tradition bien française de convivialité, nous invitons pour le cocktail qui est juste à côté. Merci et à très bientôt. Au revoir.